I now invite Professor Geeta Dharampal to introduce Professor Shambu Prasad to us. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankur, and thank you, Satish ji. I think there are a number of points that we can take up in the discussion. But now I would like to introduce our second speaker for this today's webinar, Professor Shambu Prasad, who is a professor of strategic management at the Institute of Rural Management Anand, for short IRMA, where he founded iSeed, that is IRMA's incubator for rural and social enterprises. Shambuji's interdisciplinary expertise draws from understanding the complex relation between science, technology, and society, especially innovation at the margins. His interests are in social entrepreneurship, innovation management, social and collective enterprises, and public systems management. And last but not least, public policy making. As a most versatile scholar, he has made Gandhian praxis accessible and indeed shown how relevant it is for the 21st century. Lastly, he derived inspiration from Dharampalji's work, one aspect of which he will be discussing today. Shambuji, we look forward very much to your presentation, which is entitled, let me just get the precise title, Thinking with Dharampalji on Civil Disobedience and Indian Traditions Today. Thank you very much. The mic is yours.
Thanks a lot, Geeta-ji, for the introduction, and Satish-ji for bringing out the aspects of law as inherent in the understanding of law by the British during the period that is mentioned, and some of the flaws in the way we look at it. So this opportunity to re-engage with Dharampalji's work as a student of history of science and technology and Gandhi, both of which I have not been working systematically on recently. So this is an opportunity. So reading or rereading the civil disobedience and Indian tradition has been very satisfying and also challenging. It's satisfying for the clarity on some of the basic ideas reaffirmed by the very masterly introduction by Jayaprakash Narayan that possibly the other books of Dharampalji have not had, and also for strengthening the ideas on non-cooperation and its continued role in democracy. So Gandhi as a creative dissenter, and also for us to think about newer possibilities of institutions that are hospitable, collaborative, and produce knowledge of lasting value. It's also challenging because of seeking a balance on how do we interpret that in today's time, where the relationship between the citizen and state has changed significantly, with greater concentration of power amongst few and a stifling of dissenting voices across institutions. In today's reflections, I'd like to begin with contextualizing the book that will help us understand the special moment and the people that made it happen. I'll then address the concern and motivation for the book and its connection with Gandhi. Satish-ji has mentioned some of it, Geeta-ji as well. I'll try and skip over some elements of it. I briefly touch upon the relatively growing but yet lukewarm response, academic response to the book, what it settles and possibly what the book opens up. A little bit about the rigor and craft of the book, looking at the specific events of 1810-11 and how Dharampalji was able to connect dots that otherwise seemed very disparate or as discrete events. And in a sense, reading a book is also a way of understanding how to do history and why we should possibly also look at some such episodes that may not have resulted in big moments or important for the way people have responded to situations and a kind of a people's history, if I may say. And how even some failures, even if the achieved goal was not met completely, can inspire us to make the kinds of connections that both perhaps Gandhiji did earlier and Dharampalji did later. I'll touch upon briefly on the fundamental questions posed by the book that relates to Satyagraha and democracy, and end with posing a few questions on non-cooperation today. I would suggest that unlike other of Dharampalji's work, which are in a sense celebratory about the past or about awakening Indians to a rejuvenated mind without fear, this book actually encourages us to raise more fundamental questions, or both as an engagement for and discussion today. I have a few quotations, so please permit me to use some slides, and I'll try and be quick within the time. Yeah, so, well, it's a happy coincidence that this year also happens to be the centenary year of Dr. Varghese Kurian, who founded the Institute of Rural Management, but other institutions as well. And while looking at some of his work, and I think this moment of time where certain people born at a particular generation in terms of both institution building and the faith in people. And I quote Dr. Kurian here when he says, let's rediscover the truth that the unlettered villager is often the wisest of teachers, and that without our direction and guidance, the villager survives and even thrives in conditions we could not face. Why then should we not place our faith in him and let him be responsible for his own destiny? And I think this thread runs through perhaps much of Dharampalji's work, expressed very differently though. So just to get a sense of this book, as Gitaji had mentioned, it's 50 years since its publication. One would locate this somewhere a few years after the, before the Navnirman movement and the Jayaprakash Narayan movement of 1974, a time where there was enough discontent in India about the euphoria of the freedom was well past. And, this was captured well by JP when he says, the euphoria of independence was followed by a lot of self-denigration where anything indigenous was looked down upon, and people were uncomfortable to a certain extent with that. And I thank Shastri Garu for a conversation where he said, I think it's also the time when the Gandhian institutions were declining and was lacking the intellectual rigor that was there. And in a sense, Jayaprakash Narayan's contribution in supporting public intellectuals like Dharampalji is something that is kind of, something that's kind of underplayed. So here's an academic institutions like award and the kind of support that was there from people like Jayaprakash Narayan, as even the rest of the Gandhian institutions, as I understand, couldn't understand the significance of some of the work, and that's something that JP had supported in a way. I'll skip this bit on the fact of Gandhiji's traditions, but just to quote Claude Alvarez, he would look at Dharampalji as the quintessential layman, always tentative about his findings, rarely writing with any flourish, and that's a kind of a reminder to many of us trying to write, sometimes overstating our claims and so on. Academic interest in the book, I just had a quick look. It's good to see that the Indian Economic and Social History Review's article by Krishnan quotes it recently. And there have been some works by Hardiman and much earlier by Irshik, but I think this is much, much less than what potentially could be in terms of what the book presents. Yeah, so this quote by JP is very significant. He says that Gandhiji, though was not a student of history, had a much deeper insight into it than most historians. Undoubtedly, this was an intuitive quality that was one of the secrets of his extraordinary success as a leader of the people. So the debate was whether it was from Turo or it was just a creative genius and heightened spirituality of Gandhiji. And I think Dharampalji establishes this with conclusive evidence to say that there has been a tradition which Gandhi, in a sense, tapped into. And this quotation says that Indians have had a tradition of disrespecting a law if it was just a newfangled notion, if it didn't, and that was the kind of relation that exists, and he was tapping into it by violating many of the laws which weren't in the interests of people. And there's a quotation from Mahabharata as well, where such evidence seems to be there. A king who does not respect, his citizens will be seen as Kali incarnate. So just going a bit further on this, the important part is that, interestingly, JP mentions this point that, and this is also a way of looking at history, and he says one of our faults of our forefathers was their lack of sense of history and their proneness to present even historical fact in the guise of mythology. Our knowledge happens to be limited, particularly in the field of social history. And I think that's one of the very significant contributions of Dharampalji, with the kind of meticulousness and the rigor that goes along with an understanding of Indian tradition. So interestingly, he says that in 1965, he was looking at the British archives and came across the Deccan riots. Just to remind ourselves that Dharampalji was founded by Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, which was the Indian Cooperative Union. And interestingly, the revolt against the moneylenders of the Deccan riots actually, in some sense, is attributed to the start of the Indian cooperative movement, though it became very much a state initiative then. And he says that this information was wholly unexpected. It not only led to much questioning, but also persuaded me to reread some of the writings of Mahatma Gandhi on the subject. Up to this time, like those I knew, I had taken it for granted that non-cooperation and civil disobedience were of very recent origin in India and owed their practice to Gandhiji with no precedence before that. And Gandhi's quote, of course, again, that has been said, mentioned several times, that we cease to cooperate with our rulers when they displease us, and Gandhi was aware of such traditions. Satishji has spoken about this tax being, rapacious in the way it was planned. I think 5% on all dwellings and 10% on shops every 3 months. And we do understand this word collector, because a collector would get 5% of the net receipts. It's almost like a cultural event organized in the, in a campus, and the person doing fundraising gets a share of it. There's 80 documents that have been, accessed and meticulously arranged by Dharampalji. And this is before microfilm, apparently handwritten and then typed much later. As you can see, there's a huge amount of correspondence between, and I've just taken the example of Banaras, the acting magistrate writing to the government repeatedly and the government responding and trying to understand how this phenomenon is going. Within India, there was a division on the role of non-cooperation. Dharampalji quotes both Srinivas Shastri, who felt that this could lead to anarchy, Tagore considering that it was inconsistent with the dignity of India, and Paranjpe saying respect of law and order disappears once for all. This is a short-sighted policy preparing us for infinite trouble. And of course, the quote on Gandhiji's indomitable courage and an unmatched organizational capacity that he could visualize and make effective use of instrumentalities that perhaps were originally fashioned for internal situations to deal with an alien power. Now, what are the kinds of questions that are posed by the civil disobedience? And I think this is posed by Dharampalji himself. What is the attitude of Indian people collectively as well as individually towards state power or political authority? What should be the role of Satyagraha and democracy? And Kriplani comes out very strongly where he says that Satyagraha, as commended by Gandhiji, was not merely a political weapon. It could be used in in the economic and social fields, and even against friends and family members. So, so this issue of law that has been mentioned, what is it that constitutes fundamental rights? What's the very foundation of the state or its contribution? And you know, when an act is advocated by law and favored by public opinion, and this is, Dharampalji is quoting Vinoba Bhave here, and he's saying, yet it is not put into practice. Satyagraha is necessary for its implementation should be deemed appropriate. So the broad message is that non-cooperation is not only a case that is to be dealt with an alien power, but it is an integral part of the healthy functioning and security of a free and democratic society. And those who resort to it is actually working against callousness, authoritarianism and injustice. Without them, society will end up at best in some mechanical ritual. This is Dharampalji being quoted here, or more often likely in tyranny, provoking complete anarchy and armed insurrection. So what are the opportunities for a renewed social history of India? And a quick look suggests that there's been a fairly significant work done on documenting an American tradition, Louis Perry's book in 2013. So I think one of the larger messages, especially of this, but perhaps applicable to all the works of Dharampalji, is about how do you make history and the art and craft of historiography. So there's enormous scope for connecting the dots to chart the genealogy of civil disobedience in Indian tradition. And I think this is still an unfinished kind of task. There's a second task which would encourage us to go beyond the, you know, the written tradition to consider the oral, the Katha tradition, which was perhaps best exemplified by people like Narayan Bhai Desai, who took Gandhi's Katha, but would use the Katha to also bring in contemporary issues. One of the more common ones that he had worked on was the fact that he used the Gandhi Katha in Madurai to also talk about the Kudankulam struggle at that point in time. And I think what we need to look at in both these, in the work, is to, within the broader framework of the need to rebuild institutions, drawing from a rethinking of Gandhi and perhaps also Dharampalji's work, and the role of civil society and its response in what I would consider an increasingly centralizing nation state. So just to conclude, just a few questions which I would like to pose. I don't think I have all the answers. I mean, one needs to ask ourselves today, what would Dharampalji's and Gandhi's response be to the callousness of the Indian state to the migrants that happened in May 2020? The state's being continuously partisan in establishing law and order, applying one set of laws for one and being, you know, turning a blind eye for others. The state continuously overreaching its, you know, is the dignity of a citizen, as we witnessed in the Hathras incident, where the state is doing the funeral of a person who is a victim and a Dalit at 2:30 a.m. and with the family members not even being given an opportunity for a decent burial. Now, this is the kind of environment. I mean, I don't think it's particular to any particular party, but I think this is the context in which we need to look at non-cooperation and its significance. There is another element that we need to understand is the surveillance state growing in size, not just the Pegasus controversy, but even otherwise. The controversy over the Facebook and its ability to promote hate is a feature that we cannot kind of comprehend 20 years back or even 10 years back. And this sometimes state combining with big tech to perhaps promote hate, it might work. So how do we place non-cooperation within the context of you know, truth and non-violence? And how do we see the response to the farm laws? And this is very interesting because the state had chosen to decide for citizens on what is right for them. The same kind of patronizing attitude that the British had in passing the farm laws, independent of its merit. And today we have communities responding to it and non-cooperating in a manner in which they have persisted for nearly a year. And they're aiming to be non-violent and democratic, even though there are challenges that they continue to face. And we need to understand civil disobedience within a possible representation of what we are physically facing now in the farm laws, protests, and so on. I don't have clear answers to it, but I think the point I'd like to re-emphasize is that unlike other works of Dharampalji, which is in a sense is amenable for easy celebration, the works of Dharampalji on civil disobedience and Indian traditions is actually opening up, and especially in the relationship between citizens and the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Shambu Prasad. It was a wonderful, wonderful talk. We learned a lot about